Welcome to Lectionary Call-In for Tuesday, September 7th of 2021, where two laypersons, a pastor, and an academician gather for about 50 minutes each week to discuss the Gospel Lectionary for the coming Sunday, and this Sunday is September 12th. Each Tuesday we call in from wherever we may be at 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time, and for our friend Charles Willard in Minnesota, that's 5:30 a.m. Our little team is working to be faithful to Lectionary Year B, and that puts us in the Gospel of Mark. We hope this discussion will provide areas of focus and reflection, and this is the way we do it. We develop perspectives independently after the leadoff person shares some formative questions, and then in this virtual discussion room we share, encourage, and challenge each other. And here are the folks joining us in today's discussion.
Sarah Mickelson in Tampa.
Charles Willard, Minnesota.
Bill Hall, St. Petersburg, Florida.
I'm Don Upton in Charlotte, North Carolina. Good to have all of you with us today. And the lectionary for this coming Sunday is Mark 8:27 through 38. I'll read that scripture, and I'll be using the New Revised Standard Version. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. And then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they get in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." That's the word of the Lord. Well, the first question we'll send your way, Sarah Mickelson, and I'm going to jump to the end of this selection, which is about being ashamed, or the nature of shame. And I just wanted to, for all of you, just kick that around a little bit. What's the nature of being ashamed or shame in verse 38? And is there any relevance to the 21st century? Or is this only about the time of the generation when Jesus was active in his ministry on earth? Sarah, let's start with you, please.
Well, I'm thinking about this as some foreshadowing. We know, standing on this side of the resurrection, we know a little bit about those that have, or that after Jesus was arrested and during interrogation, Peter was recognized and refused to confess he knew the Christ, and he says, "You have me confused with someone else. You're mistaken." And I'm thinking about that moment where, as human beings, we're often given a choice to confess we are knowledgeable or in communication with, are in relationship with, maybe the right way to phrase that, with Jesus and with God, and how in our culture are we given choices where we have to vary or differ ourselves from others because of what we believe or because of who we believe in. And Peter was given this really difficult choice because it almost certainly meant that he would likely be arrested and interrogated with Christ. And Peter made the decision to refuse or to deny that he knew Jesus. And I'm wondering, I believe that is relevant today. I believe this is not just a generational moment in the history book, so to speak. I believe that this is a thing that human beings continually question. And I think we have to question ourselves, perhaps not under threat of torture and interrogation in the United States, where in other countries it likely would mean that. I'm thinking that perhaps ours is more subtle or more nuanced in its decision-making process. So I asked some questions of myself, and I said, in what ways do I hide my faith to protect myself or to preserve self, maybe the right words? And in what ways do I separate or compartmentalize my daily life away from my faith? Like I practice good faith on Sunday, but come Monday morning, how does my faith interact with my daily life? In what ways does my faith prompt me in my daily decision-making, my behavior, my social media comments, the way that I vote, and my choices about what we do for a living? And there are some things I've made decisions about that I decided, I would love to become a better understanding person about wine, but I'm not sure that's a healthy pursuit, since it seems to propagate or offer up to those people who might have decision struggles about how to consume and relate to alcohol. Am I making decisions that point to my faith or point away from my faith? And why am I afraid of the judgment of others? Which seems to be the crux of the fulcrum here, or the crux and the fulcrum here. It seems like I want to hide my faith when I'm concerned about what other people will think of me. And it may be also that I'm concerned that it will change how they respond to me if they understand my relationship and my faith walk, or how ineffective my faith walk is. Maybe the right way to think about that for me. So I came up with more questions than answers, but it certainly has pricked my thinking about how I live my daily life in relationship to my faith and what I confess. Thank you, Don.
Thank you. Thank you. Bill Hull, what do you think? Shame and being ashamed.
Thank you, Sarah and Don. First of all, a comment based on my work on all three of your questions. I don't know if you intended this, Don, but for me, there's a thread through all three of your questions. So in some ways, each of them prompted thoughts and comments that are more similar than different. I think there's a thread for me, and I'll try to avoid being repetitious as I go forward, but just acknowledging that they stir similar thoughts. Now, I don't know, what I'm about to say is the risk of taking a concept from our time and superimposing it on Scripture, but I'll take the risk. There are students of the human mind and human interactions who make a differentiation between shame and guilt. Simplistically, if I feel guilty, that means I did something that was bad. If I feel shame, it means I am bad. You hear the difference? Okay. The guilt can be circumstantial. Shame is existential. I am a bad person. So if any of that applies to Scripture times, Jesus is using here a very powerful word, shame, very existential. Now, this gets into what comes up for me in all three questions. I think what's at work here is the difference between Jesus's understanding of his mission and, in this case, Peter's. This story is recorded in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. Now, I don't think it's greatly significant, but in Matthew's version, in chapter 16, Jesus first commends Peter. You know, keys of the kingdom. On this rock I will build my kingdom. And then later in Matthew's account, Peter confronts Jesus. Mark, being the earlier gospel, interesting, leaves out that affirmation and immediately gets into this conflict or this challenge between Jesus and Peter. And I think I will reserve my comments about what I think are the differences between Jesus' understanding and Peter, because it comes up under your subsequent questions. But just for the moment, I would say this signals to us, this at the end of this passage, this issue of shame, I think really gets at the core of this debate or dialogue between Jesus and Peter. It is so important that it can lead to a sense of shame on the part of those who profess to be followers of Jesus. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. It's a powerful force, isn't it? Being ashamed, or the fear of being ashamed. It's powerful in a prideful way, and it's powerful in a fearful way. I don't want to be ashamed, or I don't want to be ashamed of you, or I'd be ashamed if you don't do it my way. If you're facilitating a class or moderating a discussion this week, as you listen in, you might be thinking about that. You know, talk about a human attribute that you can kick a class off with. You know, talk about the power of being ashamed. What does it mean? I think every human being in a class or in a circle would be able to talk about that. It might be a good starting place. It helped me just going through that exercise myself. Being ashamed is being, and I think it's connected to the 21st century too, because I think we have in common with each other. Because of my action, I'm embarrassed. And this one has a funny angle in it because it actually has something to do with somebody else, my perception of somebody else's actions as well. I'm choosing to believe it's irrelevant because embarrassment is so powerful. It's almost an act of creation. It may not even be connected to reality. I'm running away from something, or I have high expectations for somebody. I think it's connected to evasion too, not wanting to confront something that might be real, to run away from the facts because it doesn't fit into my idea of the world I want to live in. But if it's about me, I think it's a fear of getting it wrong. And then think about Peter too, right? But I'm going to make it about myself. A fear of getting it wrong, fear of being found out, a fear of being seen as a pretender, fear of keeping bad company, a fear of being on the wrong side. But now how does this get turned on its head? It's really, I think, turning that into Jesus. Think about a friend or someone that might have let you down because of, I'll make it personal again, my expectations about what my friends should do. What a powerful act of creation I have in terms of my expectations for a relationship. And think about the Christ. You are not who I thought you were. Whether you say it out loud or you say it to yourself, boy, that's a powerful thing. You broke our understanding. You can hear an echo if you've ever thought that or said it. The other person would go, what understanding? What are you talking about? You know, you had an obligation to me. You put me at risk. Now I'm thinking about Peter outside the trial. You put me at risk with your behavior. You made me seem silly and wrong. So I think that's the nature of some of this, is it's turned back on the Christ. And then to go back into the trial and the crucifixion, I do not want to be, and it sounds like the Christ, I do not want to be mocked, scourged, interrogated, ridiculed. Oh my. Charles, how about you? Any thoughts on this component of the passage of being ashamed?
I'm a little worried that we're spending so much focus on Jesus' accusation here, and it's because he hasn't talked about the cross before. His mention of the cross up there, further up in the text up here in verse 34, is the first time that the end story gets defined, at least by Mark. We don't know when it actually occurred in the conversations that Jesus had among his disciples, when they actually realized what was happening. And I'm just wondering what how this would have been heard by Mark's readers, how they would have interpreted it as they first heard it, because if Jesus is here saying, those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in glory. Does that mean that Jesus is telling his disciples, well, you've been ashamed of me now, so that's it for you when the time comes later on? We don't think that, but that's what we read. So what can Mark, and we really can't know what Jesus was thinking at this point. I keep saying that, but it's hard to get across. We don't know what Jesus was thinking. We don't know that. All we know are words that Mark has put in his mouth decades after he actually said them, and there's no chance to open them up going back, and there's certainly no better chance to open them up going 50 years later. So where are we? I don't know.
It does smack or sound like these words were added after Peter's denial, after the resurrection. So this sense of we're not getting only the story prior to, we're getting the story through the lens of what happens through the whole scope of the interrogation, the denial, and we know that there's resolution between Peter and Christ about this denial. And I think one of the juxtapositions I sense here is maybe we're hearing through the writing of Mark the language that Peter would have told us. And so that makes me scratch my head and think about shame is internal. You can't make someone feel shame. They either do or they don't, and it becomes intrinsically self-inflicting. And I'm thinking about Peter's perspective here, and that he would be unique in being able to share that, and understanding how that would draw, if you will, a separation or a break in the relationship. If you feel shame, it's a force of destruction, not creation. I'm thinking about how do you remedy that. So that your dialogue led me there, Charles. Thank you.
As we go through this, and especially looking at the seminarians participating in this, there's also the time that this is written, and the nature of the early church and what they were going under, and the disruption, the uprootedness that was going on. So I think that may be a better lens in this case to look through, instead of what Jesus is thinking, but what is going on, what's being carried through to a very, very challenging time, also in social, political history. Let's go on to the next one, because they do connect in a number of ways. So, Bill Hull, this is coming at you. Is it possible for Peter to set his mind on divine things versus human things? What, if anything, can we learn from the counterpoint of setting your mind on divine things versus human things? Bill?
In some ways, I'm going to springboard from the ending of the previous conversation, Charles' concern and Sarah's reaction. An impression I had for the first time in studying this passage, several. One was, and again, this is my assumption, when Jesus says, You remember he says, what are people saying? And it's John the Baptist, Elijah, still others, one of the prophets, and Matthew adds Jeremiah in there. And then, of course, the question, who do you say that I am? I think it's possible that there's no one right answer to that. And Jesus isn't asking for the right answer. He's asking for his disciples' understanding of that question. You follow me? Because I think in truth, there are many right answers to who Jesus Christ is. An exhaustible imagery. And back to the harshness of this passage, the being ashamed is not the only harshness in this passage. Jesus calls Peter Satan. Now, however Mark composed his gospel, and I like to think that he was reflecting later, gathering material, and saying to himself, okay, what's going on, and when did disciples learn something? And I think I heard you say, Charles, this is the first time in Mark that Jesus speaks of his crucifixion suffering. I hadn't thought about that. Assuming that's true, I think the harshness of shame and Satan is Mark is saying, folks, you really need to get this. This is critically important. Don't miss it. And the other thing that struck me was, now, Peter, it says, took Jesus aside, and then in his response, it says he included the disciples. Think of it, what little I think I understand. Peter is rebuking his rabbi. And instead of Peter being impertinent, I hear him being honest. And I think there is a openness and even a kind of intimacy in this interchange between Peter and Jesus. Think about it. I think a shallow understanding of friendship is whatever you say, I agree with you, or I won't challenge you. I will never judge you. And I appreciate in this weekly lectionary dialogue, we respect each other, and yet we have differences. And to me, this is a powerful example of an honest, open friendship. Peter is honest about his feeling shame. Wait a minute, Jesus, you can't say that. That can't be true. So I like to think I've sensed a richness to this dialogue I hadn't sensed before. Because previously I thought, well, Peter's being impertinent. He just doesn't get it. Peter is being honest. And I think what comes out is that Peter's understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus' mission is was not congruent with Jesus's. And that struggle goes on throughout the gospel narrative. Now, a quote from Leanne Van Dyke, who's the president of Columbia Seminary, in a commentary in the publication Connections, getting at Peter's misunderstanding. She said, "We would rather write Jesus' job description for our convenience than follow Jesus where he calls." And then in applying this to preaching, she says, "The challenge of preaching is to unmask false messiahs, not only in other communities, but also in one's own." And I like in her commentary where she says, for example, we could say people who thought Jesus was commissioning them to engage in the insurrection earlier this year on January the 6th, we can say, that's not a Jesus that I have met. So Leanne Van Dyke says, wait a minute, that's fine to notice that. How is it that we don't understand the suffering Messiah? And it seems to me, Don, to get at this term divine, it means a willingness, to use some metaphorical language, to live in another universe. not one that's seemingly totally logical or consistent. Because in our earthbound logic, we don't want people to suffer. We don't want that to be a part of life. And I think to have a divine set of eyes, ears, spirit, is to be open to a life-enriching and life-sustaining world in which suffering can be redemptive. Yet another example, and I'll finish with this. I'm the lead next week, so I've been working on the passage coming up. Guess what, folks? We're going to be right back here. Where we go in chapter 9 is Jesus again saying that he's going to suffer. And what do the disciples do as they walk away from that and journey? They argue among themselves, which is the greatest. You talk about not getting it. I laugh, but in fact, it's also our dilemma. And so I'm left with the question, I don't have the answer. How is it that I'm missing the misunderstanding who Jesus is today in my life in this world? I'll stop there.
Thank you. What helped me with the how is it is to take it to the extreme. And I've got a yes and no and a yes and no on this, but in one extreme, it's he can't set his mind on divine things. He can't. I mean, whether you view it as irony or just an impossibility, for me it was helpful to go, you can't. No, you can't. Whether you're a Christian or just a lover of literature here, the scriptures are set up for the answer to be, he can't. These are the scriptures of Moses hiding his face between a rock as God passes. Can't. So that actually helps me with that. Setting his mind on divine things is not in the picture. It is not possible. Not possible for this human. Maybe not possible for me. For some reason, that helped me. I'll go back to Genesis 3. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he came. Out he goes. Peter's answer is his answer, and I think it's my answer too. There's no better way. There's no better path. Take it from me. In my view, outside the garden, I can take the measure of other people and their attitudes, and I can save our own necks for a while if you do it my way. Now, there's another answer to this, too, but I like that. No, you can't do it. It's not possible. That's why there's a Christ. But at least on the other answer would be for me is you can ask the question. You can pursue the divine. You can ask, and this is about, can you ask the question? What are people saying? He didn't say, there's nothing in here saying, let's not talk about third-party interpretations of who the Christ is. That's okay. You may pursue, you may ask, but don't declare, not yet. How about you, Sarah?
There is such a temptation when we are confronted with an outcome that we don't like, that we want to reshape it and volunteer to go, I'll just move the furniture around. I'll make it look better. I can improve on this outcome. I can improve on this story. I think that's a very human condition. And it started when, I was 2 and I decided I would open the milk carton myself and not need help. I do myself. And I said, as if we know better how the story might unfold or finish. And it is most often that when I can't really see or imagine the outcome, that I want to volunteer to reshape it and influence it. And I seem to do this without any humility. I seem to do it like, I know how to fix this. I'm good at this. I step right up, and I do it with such, I don't even know what the word is, pride or just ignorance. So when it is most hard for us to hear or to understand, I think we do exactly what Peter does. Oh, no, Lord, don't go to Jerusalem. It's bad there. They want to kill you. Let's go the opposite direction. I think that is a perfect example of humanity wanting to rewrite the purposes and mission of Christ. I said we want to deny the truth and replace it with something more easily accepted, palatable, understood, digestible. We want to make it less harsh than what it is. And I think that we're asked to, in all humility, consider what God is offering as the perfect solution instead of one that can be modified and improved upon. And that when we have the audacity to perceive that we can improve upon it is when we step right in the paint bucket and invite trouble to come. So I'm thinking of the old story of the wizard or the magician's apprentice who's given enough information to end up getting all the brooms to bring all the water and fill the castle with water. And finally, the magician returns home and says, enough. And it's like the magician's apprentice, and I'm thinking of the Walt Disney version of this story in my head, realizes that he didn't have the whole picture. He didn't have the whole story. And he could start the conversation, but he couldn't see how to finish it. And that could be another way of Dragonona story with pasta, where the bubbling pasta pot just keeps giving out pasta and pasta and pasta. And all you have to say is thank you, and it will stop. But if you don't know that, you end up with pasta that overtakes the town and covers all the houses, and people can't eat enough to keep up with it. So I'm curious as to our inability to accept a hard answer. We want to make it palatable. We want to water it down. We want to make it easier. Don't use that word, Christ. Use this word. It's much more nuanced about what you want to do. And I'm thinking that frequently is the temptation that humanity brings to the table. And we have to relax the temptation and live into the truth. And that's really difficult for us. So I think this is a constant divine versus human thinking that we do on a daily basis.
Thank you. Charles, what are your thoughts? Divine versus human.
Well, I'm sort of sorry that we started out by jumping down to the last verse, so we never really got back to the way things got started in the early parts of the text that we had to work with. The comment I want to make, and I'm not trying to make it nice for Peter and for the other disciples, but if you think about it, we look at Peter and Mark and the other disciples from way after it all happened. So we know how the story ends. And we can say, oh, those poor, stupid idiots, they just never got it right. What was the matter with them? Imagining, but being careful not to say it, if I had been there, I would have seen it right away, and it would have saved us a whole lot of trouble. Well, of course, that didn't happen. The problem is that what, and this is my imagination, so who knows, what Peter and John and Mark and the others who were following Christ were what they were seeing was the coming of the kingdom as they had learned that it would be for generations in their existence. What happened? God came in and did away with the enemy in murderous fashion. I mean, it wasn't as though Israel and Jerusalem were open land, just sitting there. They were populated. And what the story in the Old Testament is, in part at least, is that the children of Israel came up, although it took them a long time to get there. 40 years is not, if you're walking around, it's a long time, I'm thinking. But they finally got there, and they got there not because the people who were there said, oh, it's time to go, we're going to move on someplace else, and here was just all this open land. They got there because they were done in. So what other examples did John and Peter have in terms of what was going to happen when this act of reclaiming was repeated? It was going to be the kind that didn't require the death of their leader. That would, did David die on the battlefield? No. Did the other successful Israelites die on the battlefield? No, they were successful. How else could these disciples imagine that it was going to turn out? And when from time to time Jesus suggested that it was going to be some other way, that simply was in conflict with their whole tradition. So give them a break.
Thanks, Charles. Well, final question, Sarah Mickelson, coming at you. The disciples are asked to speak about Jesus in many ways as they play roles in the ministry on earth and all the supporting logistics that goes with it. They are talking about Jesus, after all. They're supporting his movement around the communities. Here, they're told not to tell anyone about it. What kind of line is being established when it comes to speaking or not speaking about Jesus? Sarah?
Okay. Are we confident that we understand who Jesus is? And if we are confident, are we truthful about who we believe Christ to be? And I don't know that we can articulate that. It's almost like if I asked a bear to describe their life, I might even not understand because I don't speak bear. It's that unique. And so I'm thinking there's some wonderful breakthrough technology being talked about where people can actually interact and dialogue with dolphins. Using a series of whistles and clicks and a translator, people are starting to have a conversation with underwater wild dolphins. And I'm thinking about how do we articulate to each other? And how do we understand each other? And given that we are flawed in how we speak to each other, what words we use, and how we can describe, and even flawed in our understanding, I kind of think about this as like, are we able to speak about this? And when we volunteer our perception and our perspective, volunteering, not being asked, but volunteering it ahead of time, do we run the risk of a flawed perspective falling into unprepared ears? And it means that there's an unteachable moment because, it's kind of like having a bumper sticker in your car. It invites as many people to hate you as it would to like you. So perhaps because we can only see the partial truth of who Christ is, we will muddy the water before we can share it with others. And in sharing the muddied water, we're making it worse rather than making it better. So I'm thinking about Peter's inability to see who Christ is, and that flawed perspective becoming a problem. We have to stand in the full revelation of who Christ is and go, I cannot really articulate this for anyone other than myself, and this is where I stand, or this is what I can see at this moment, or this is what I've come to understand. the benefit of 59 years of walking on the earth, this is what I've come to understand about the Christ. And I'm worried that people will hear that and think if they don't have that experience, they must not know Christ. And I'm not confident that I have the authority or the wisdom to actually say that's true. Because the Christ you might see or you might experience or you might interact with may be very different than the Christ I have imagined him to be. And I don't want to superimpose my flawed perspective onto someone else. So I hear these words with trepidation, and I recognize that if I try to articulate who Christ is for Christ, I am not going to be the right mouthpiece for this. I do not know, and I do not have the mind of Christ, and I never will. I'm going to pursue it, but I probably will never attain it.
That is really exciting, the way you put that. Because I don't know if you're intending for like me to go to extreme, but on one hand, it's be careful, don't know, careful. But on the other hand, there's this discipline of being aware, all through the letters of the New Testament. It's like, listen, think, listen again, be patient, coming to you. But that's intentional too. There's a discipline and intentionality to all of these things. And I remember, Sarah, there was a pastor at the church where all of us met, Palmacia Presbyterian Church, which makes this podcast possible. And this goes back a decade. Jeff Kohler, who's in a different part of the country now. But Jeff Kohler, when we were on this passage on the lectionary cycle way back, was doing research on the image of Christ. Sarah, you may remember that. And when he preached on this, he said, he asked people who in the congregation that go to traditional worship in the sanctuary, what is Christ? And he said they always said something that had to do with Christ at the door. Everybody seemed to say the same thing. Now, why do people that go into the sanctuary at that church think it's Christ at the door? Because, Sarah, you know the answer, right?
There's a big stained glass window.
There's a big stained glass window at the front. It's Christ at the door. So it's unconscious. Now, there's a discipline in that. Somebody chose that window, right? There's to do that, and it's seated in memory. I'm not saying it's bad or good, but it's seated with everyone because someone chose to buy a window that's at the front of the church. And then he went to the contemporary worshipers, many who had never been in the sanctuary, and I've got the note here. Let's say he said those who'd never seen the image ever before. They said. What about the image you have of Christ? They say, no, I'm here to see what the Lord is calling me to do. There was no image at all in the sanctuary. I thought that was really pertinent in terms of be careful, but also the discipline. Everything we do needs to be intentional and careful and think about that. And it goes to the questions. This is a passage about asking questions. So now I'm going to pull up one more thing. Debbie Thomas wrote about this in 2018, same passage. And it was about the questions. And she said, I love that Peter's confession of faith, you are the Messiah, signals the beginning of his exploration of Jesus' identity, not its end. As soon as Peter thinks he has the answer to the question nailed down, Jesus shuts him up, challenges what he knows, and nudges him back to the starting line. Yes, I'm the Messiah. No, you have no idea what the Messiah means. In fact, you're not ready to know the Messiah means. You can barely tolerate my talking about it. So there's much more for you to learn, Peter. So many more answers for you to grow into. Be patient. Don't force the locked doors. Try to love what is unsolved. Keep living the question. Again, that's a quote from Debbie Thomas in September of 2018. Back to the questions, the discipline of asking questions. Bill Hull, what do you think about this?
First of all, to use, again, a modern-day concept, we need to pay close attention to the timestamp on this. Because, as we know, at the end of his life on earth, as recorded in Matthew 28, Jesus says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you." No restraint. Go and tell it all. So Jesus is saying this at a particular point in time. And it strikes me that, and I think I'm echoing what you and Sarah said, that the disciples are not yet ready to go and proclaim something they don't understand. A humorous example of sorts. Back in the mid-'60s when I entered seminary, then the majority of us had gone from high school to college to seminary. And in that entering class, which back in the dark ages was all male, the majority of us were not married. Many of us were engaged, and the wedding planners were kept real busy the summer between our first and second year of seminary. Many of us came back married. In that first year, one of the first-year students in a preaching seminar preached the sermon on marriage and parenting. Now, he was not married. Part of their feedback was, "You don't know what you're talking about." You get what I'm saying. Even now, as a grandfather, I would be reluctant to preach a message. What does it mean to have a Christian marriage and to be a Christian parent? I still don't fully know. Okay, just to take one example. So I think it's the educational concept of readiness. Now, Sarah, I'm going to briefly echo something you said earlier in this conversation. While Jesus was still alive, the Scripture tells us that there were moments when they then understood. I think it's in all three gospel accounts that Jesus had predicted that Peter would deny. And in Matthew 26, it says, then after the cock crowed 3 times, then Peter remembered what Jesus had said. Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Another in Mark 11, then Jesus remembered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. So even during his life, there were times that, in effect, Peter said, oh, now I get it. And, of course, most powerfully after the death of Jesus in John 12, his disciples did not understand these things at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered these things had been written of him and had been done to him. So I think it's, for me, and I'm sure there's more to it than this, it's a matter of timing and readiness. And then later this year, I'm going to teach a Sunday morning Sunday school class on the other lectionary passages. We tend to always focus on the gospel. So each week I go and look at the other ones. This week in Isaiah 50, which is the prophecy for this week in the lectionary, is this, Jim, the Lord God has given me the tongue of a teacher that I may know how to sustain the weary with a word. Morning by morning, God wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. I love that. Wakens my ear to listen as those who are taught. Here's someone who says, God has called me to be a teacher, given me the tongue of a teacher to sustain those who are weary. But it's like every morning, God has to reawaken my ear to listen as those who are taught. One of my mantras is, if we're willing to learn, everything that happens teaches. We can reflect and learn. And I'll stop with that, Don.
Thank you. And Charles, we're going to wrap up with you. What are your thoughts about this?
I'm still puzzled.
Thank you. That might be the best way to finish up. I will echo that. I am still puzzled, and I think we're supposed to say that continuously and to each other, that it's okay to say we're puzzled. It's okay. It's maybe not okay to declare what we believe to be true out of a fear of being ashamed. And I thank you all for listening in. We appreciate folks who listen to this podcast. It's part of enthusiasm. I know I speak for all of us for the whole week, each week to come. And Palma Ceia Presbyterian Church is located at 3501 West San Jose Street. That's in Tampa, Florida. And for more information, you can go to palmaceia.org, PALMACEIA.org. And at that site, you'll also see other lessons, other discussions of lectionary, other questions, lots of puzzlements, lots of questions. I would say that that's a church that's driven by questions. Sermons, reflections, prayers, outstanding music, and communion. And you're always welcome, and we'll see you next time.